in English. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today we have with us the newly elected chair of the IPCC, Hoesung Lee, the new co-chair of, or one of the two new co-chairs of Working Group 1, Valérie Masson-Delmotte, and one of the new co-chairs of the IPCC's Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, Kiyoto Tanabe. We also have the acting secretary of the IPCC, Bruce Stewart. My name is Jonathan Lin. And so each of the three Bureau members will give a very short opening statement, and then we'll be very happy to take your questions. So I'll hand over to Dr. Lee. Hoesung, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. We are very happy to be here to meet you. And let me just briefly remark what will be the different nature of IPCC's assessment in the upcoming sixth assessment cycle. We will emphasize very much about the solution aspect of climate change problems. And secondly, our operations will be very much inclusive, incorporating knowledges and intellectual inputs from experts in the developing countries. More than ever before, we need such information, regional information in the developing countries for the success of the climate change, for the success of tackling the climate change problems. Thirdly, we will definitely want to improve our capability of communicating the important scientific messages to the world. And with these three bases, our next assessment, our next task of IPCC will be operated. Thank you very much. With this very brief introduction, we'll be happy to answer to any of your questions.
Thank you. We'll just have a quick statement from Valérie and then Kiyoto. Yeah?
Good morning. So on the co-chair side, we are starting our work. The next steps will be to prepare a commentary on the 23 topics proposed for special reports. And COP21 was an opportunity for many of us to meet physically, exchange more easily than by email, and structure the way we aim to better integrate the work of the three different working groups. And we are also working to implement the technical support units of the different working groups. For Working Group 1, in agreement with the co-chair Pan Maojai from China, it will be hosted in France at Paris-Saclay University. And also in the next months, we will start the dialogue for the scoping of the next assessment report. Thank you.
Thank you, Valérie. Kiyoto?
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm Kiyoto Tanabe from Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, TFI. TFI has been working on methodological guidance for national greenhouse gas inventories that is crucially important for as a basis for good MRV system, and we are very happy to continue working on that aspect to contribute to the UNFCCC process.
Thanks, Kiyoto. So we'll take questions now. Seth Bornstein, please.
Thank you. Seth Bornstein, AP. For Dr. Lee, there's talk again about not just the 2-degree goal here, but a 1.5-degree goal. From a science perspective, is a 1.5-degree goal possible? How likely and possible is it to achieve a 1.5-degree goal here? You know, or is it, are we already committed beyond beyond that, as some have said? And even, can you tell us the sort of, I know it's a Working Group 2 question, what would be the differences we would see in impacts between a 1.5 and a 2-degree world?
The question involves both Working Group 1 and Working Group 2 and also Working Group 3. And you know that our last assessment indicates that out of the 1,200 scenarios we investigated, there were very few scenarios studying the 1.5 degree C case. And that's the reason why the information provided by the last assessment what was somewhat scanty about the 1.5 degree C implication. Now, the regard to the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees C in terms of impacts and vulnerability, the report very clearly indicated that a great deal of impacts, vulnerabilities could be avoided if the world succeeds in 2 degrees C stabilization. And anything more, Valérie could add.
So maybe it's also nice to remind that the 2-degree target is a political choice and was never prescribed by scientists. The last report clearly shows that the magnitude of warming will generate, depending on its magnitude, the risk of severe, pervasive, and sometimes irreversible impacts, and sometimes also beyond adaptation capabilities. And between 1.5 and 2 degrees, there are, I would say, 2 examples of long-term consequences. One is for coral reefs as a specifically vulnerable ecosystem. Another one is for the long-term risks related to ice sheet destabilization and sea level rise. But there was no mandate for IPCC in the last assessment report to specifically address what would be the climate impact for 1.5 to 2.5 or 3 degrees. The work was based on specific scenarios of radiative perturbations, and so it's not, the analysis was not focused on these aspects.
Yeah.
Thanks. In terms of the ice sheet destabilization difference between 1.5 and 2, can you tell us a little bit more about this? Are we talking gigatons of ice sheet melting at 1.5 that would not be melting at 2 that would not be melting at 1.5, large portions of Greenland or West Antarctica? I mean, could you frame it a little more specifically on what type of differences would we see in ice sheet destabilization?
So the finding of the 5th assessment report, Working Group 1, was that there is a threshold that on the very long term can lead to irreversible loss of the Greenland ice sheet, for instance. The threshold, there is uncertainty associated with this threshold, which is between 1 and 3 degrees. So this is still part of gaps in the scientific knowledge. And there's also large uncertainty about potential thresholds associated with the Antarctic ice sheet response. There's new science emerging since the 5th assessment report, published almost every month on these topics.
Thank you. Just to amplify Dr. Lee's reply, a reminder that the IPCC is an assessment body, not a research body, and so we rely on the scientific community to produce the research, for example, on a 1.5 degree world, for us to assess it. So a question there in the aisle, the lady holding up your hand there. Yep.
Hi, Jade Lingard, Mediapart. Prior to COP21, we discovered that China's greenhouse gas emissions were higher than what they had published. My question is, how accurate, in your view, are countries' greenhouse gas emissions figures, given that, for instance, some of these countries have very large informal economic activities in their economy, so that makes it very difficult to really measure. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Kiyoto, would you like to take that one? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. What we can say is that the IPCC is providing a solid methodology to estimate and report greenhouse gas emissions, anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions from various sources in the country. And as far as the country is using appropriately the methodology provided by the IPCC Task Force on National Greenhouse Gas Inventories, the estimation of greenhouse gas emissions and removals should be good and reliable. But on the other hand, it depends on what kind of data those countries are using. And it is, we are not in a good position to comment on that aspect. What kind of data they are using, we don't know, so we cannot, it's a little bit difficult for us to comment on that aspect.
Thank you. There was a question here in the front row with the camera.
I remember in Copenhagen that almost all the developing countries said that they wanted the temperature to be below 1.5, and it was just ignored in the middle of the night, and suddenly 2 became the limit. And I remember being at an IPCC meeting, and one of the scientists said that at 2 degrees, the poor, the disenfranchised, and the vulnerable would not survive, and at 1.5 they might. I was wondering if you'd comment on that.
Thank you. Well, of course, as Valérie said, those targets are not set by the IPCC. They're set by governments, but maybe...
Again, as was mentioned before, 2 degrees C was determined by political leaders, policymakers, and 1.5 degrees C, if there was such demand for the consideration by political leaders and the policymakers, then we will be able to see what sort of scientific literature there to be assessed. And we are, again, the scientific assessment body. We are not a body that considers the political considerations.
Thank you. Gentleman in the front row here.
Thank you. Leo Hickman from Carbon Brief. You mentioned, Dr. Lee, about the scoping for AR6 will begin very soon, maybe next month. AR5 sort of suggested that emissions globally need to peak within this decade and rapidly descend after that point. In many ways, we might not have time to be policy relevant to wait another 6-7 years for a full cycle of the IPCC to run. Therefore, the special report maybe that might be coming up next is particularly important. And you said you wanted the next round of the assessment report to focus on solutions and to be important for key regions and developing regions. Can you explain the crucial this scoping period? Can you explain what you're going to be looking at and focusing on early? Because what the IPCC publishes in the next, say, 2 or 3 years is going to be very key in terms of, particularly around Working Group 3 subjects. I'd like you to just respond on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj, for the question about the scoping process. As you mentioned, the scoping process is the very, very important steps for our assessment. And in the upcoming cycle, we try to improve our scoping process in such a way that all relevant policy, the important questions, will be incorporated in the scoping process, as well as all relevant knowledge and intellectual inputs from the developing regions should be incorporated in the scoping process. I believe that this design stage of the assessment are all incorporated in the scoping process. We really want to improve our scoping process that include all relevant informations, all relevant policy questions be handled in the scoping process. At the end, we believe that such a thoroughly done scoping process will be a guarantee to produce really a policy-relevant assessment reports. Well, we need to consider within the Bureau, IPCC leadership, considering obviously there are constraints on time, constraints on also the financial availability, but we would like to achieve as much as effectiveness as well as efficiency.
Question here in the second row.
Good morning, Claudio Angelo with OECO in Brazil. My question is for Dr. Tanabe. Dr. Tanabe, the current IPCC guidelines for reporting land use emissions allow for some countries one case is Brazil, it reports a big sequestration from protected areas, such indigenous lands, when in fact those areas are not sequestering all that carbon. Are those guidelines going to be reviewed?
Yep. The current guidelines, the latest guidelines by the IPCC is 2006 IPCC guidelines that was produced almost 10 years ago. And we are now doing a technical assessment of the IPCC guidelines, those guidelines. And we are identifying some areas to further improve. And so we are now in that process. And probably in the near future, we will do some sort of refinement, not full revision, but partial improvement or refinement. That's a possibility. But that must be, approved by the IPCC plenary, decided by the IPCC plenary. So that's all what I can say at this stage.
Alistair Doyle and the...
Thank you, Alistair Doyle from Reuters. Dr. Tanabe, I wonder if I could follow up a bit about measurement of emissions, please. What are the most promising technologies, people launching satellites and so on, and how far will you be able to narrow down the wide uncertainty ranges you've got about the level of emissions by the time the next report comes out, please? But mostly the technologies, please.
It's a little bit difficult question to answer because there are many technologies, and we are still in the process of technical assessment of the current inventory guidelines, and so we are reviewing many of those technologies for future further development of inventory guidelines. But at this stage, I cannot tell you specifically what technologies are the best for the future work.
Thank you. Question over there.
Hi, David Unger with the Christian Science Monitor. Thanks for having this talk. I wonder, we often hear that the 2 degrees target is a political target and not a scientific one. And I recognize it's not IPCC's role to sort of set the targets, but are there other metrics or other ways of measuring that the scientific community would prefer to see explored or reflected in some of the climate negotiating process?
As you know, there are many indicators that show the increasing problems of global warming, and temperature is just one such indices. And the sea level rise, and there are many other such indicators. Again, what sort of indicators the policy decisions will have to use, that depends upon the decisions by the policymakers. And again, if such decisions of using alternative metrics, then the scientific community will analyze the implications of such a call.
Question there, yeah.
Hello, Franco Montalto, Drexel University. You mentioned that the next 6th report will emphasize solutions, and I'm wondering to what extent there'll be a connection between particular infrastructure strategies, planning strategies, development strategies, and incremental reductions in emissions. How much will the report seek to quantify that?
Solution involves the linking the global strategies into the strategies that the member governments and also the relevant decision-making entities feel very dear to their well-being. And so far, we have been very successful in conveying the risks and the problems and opportunities in the global sense. We are beginning to see the increasing demand for such information be available at the regional scale, at much lower scales. And in order to provide really viable solutions to the policymakers, decision makers, we need to find a very close link between the global information to the local information that will be actionable at the level of local decision makers.
Thank you. Valérie, do you want to say something on that?
Maybe just to stress that the regional dimension is also important in the physical science basis to inform local policymakers. and therefore it is expected to strengthen the regional approach also for Working Group 1 with respect to climate projections and also for regional sea level projections.
Question at the back there. Thank you.
Bilal Anwar, I'm advising the Ministry of Climate Change. We're hearing a lot about the global carbon budget, and there are several numbers. I think the most prominent one is 2,900 carbons. So I was wondering, and a large part of it is already exhausted. I was wondering whether this number is also coming from the scientific basis of IPCC, or is just another political figure which is roaming around?
So this is one of the key findings of the IPCC fifth assessment report for the Working Group 1. So the conclusion that future temperature rise in all climate simulations is related to the cumulative CO2 emissions, and therefore any policy target, such as 2 degrees, can be translated with a given level of confidence into a certain range of compatible carbon budget. But note that the uncertainty range reported in our report was large because it includes uncertainties with respect to climate sensitivity and uncertainties related to the global carbon cycle itself.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. I'm asking about this 2 degrees average, but in the projections, there are other areas where the projections give temperature rise of 4-6 degrees Celsius. So how this different, of the variation of the future projections have been taken into account in the agreement or in the Paris Agreement. So how these impacts of these, different variations in the future projections have been taken or will be taken in the agreement. Thank you.
Okay, well, the question about the agreement is really for the negotiators here rather than the IPCC, but maybe the panel can comment in general on your point.
I just want to remind you that the world has already agreed to achieve 2 degrees stabilization based upon the scientific understanding of that the BAU, such as the BAU scenario, such as the world will face 4 degrees C increase will not be acceptable, and that decision was already made.
But maybe to provide some background, the measure of change in temperature at the surface of our planet is one of a global indicator of the increased energy stored in the climate system. Change in sea level is another indicator of that. And when climate is changing, the temperature change is not uniform. It's always larger over continents than over land, and particularly strong over the Arctic. So there are regional dimensions, and the use of the global mean temperature at the Earth's surface is just to reduce different amounts of climate change to just one single global matrix. And already in the Arctic today, warming has been beyond 2 degrees.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.